Okay. So, fake news. This is quite a buzzword. We've heard it quite a lot recently, often used as a term of abuse and sometimes used accurately to describe news that is, in some sense, fake. There are various ways of conceptualizing, i.e. defining what it means for news to be fake. Some would argue, and I have some sympathy with this argument, that basically all news is to a greater or lesser extent fake, simply because we can't know the full truth of any given story. But of course, there are also egregious, fairly obvious attempts to just lie, and that I suppose you could fairly say is even more fake than the average everyday fake news. Anyway, let's get started. We're going to talk about not only what fake news is and how you can possibly spot it, but how you can utilize computer science in order to help machines spot it for you. And if you really want to, and if you're quite dastardly, you can also use the same techniques so that you can have machines write it for you. So you can basically reverse engineer everything that I'll be talking about to create a fake news bot if you're sort of got malice intent. Anyway, so what even is fake news? Well, okay, this is a term that's quite commonly associated with former President Trump. And he used it quite commonly as a stick to beat what he would call the mainstream media, or sometimes lamestream media. So here's one of his sort of fairly typical tweets on the matter. The fake news media is going crazy. They are totally unhinged, and in many ways, after witnessing firsthand the damage they do to so many innocent and decent people, I enjoy watching. In 7 years, when I am no longer in office, their ratings will dry up and they will be gone. Now, he was, of course, miscalculating the number of years he would be in the White House there, but never mind. The point is that Donald Trump made quite a big deal of describing certain portions of the media, basically those which ever gave him critical coverage, as fake. Now, I think it's fairly clear that he is coming from a position of significant bias, but it still begs certain questions about what is fake news and how can we differentiate between reliable sources of information and lesser reliable sources of information. And as already teed up, basically all information is to a greater or lesser extent untrue, because the truth is frankly unobtainable. The truth on any given topic is so complicated and multifaceted that we even with a lifetime's worth of study, we wouldn't be able to understand it fully. And news, of course, is a mechanism for editorializing a lot of complex content. So, for example, let's say you're reading a story about the civil war in Syria. What would be the true story of that? And how could it possibly be consumed by any individual? I mean, the real story of the Syrian conflict would surely have to go back to the very dawning of civilization in that part of the Middle East, and would have to have a sort of continuous multi-stream narrative with all of the relevant data all packaged together. Now, for a start, those data don't even exist. There will be gaps, extraordinary gaps, which is part of the work of a historian to try and put links between gaps in data. But even if we were somehow miraculously capable of obtaining that data, it would be such an enormous quantity as to be incomprehensible by any individual human being. So when you read a news article that's a couple of hundred words trying to tell you about the Syrian civil war, it's obviously not going to give you the truth. It's going to give you a snippet, a portion of the truth. So what we need to be careful with is that there's not necessarily a distinction that can clearly be drawn between fake and real news. Even the real news is partial, is editorialized, is limited in its capacity to communicate truth. But, you know, without getting too philosophical about these things, there are more or less fake sources of fake news, and specifically some sources that claim to be newsworthy are just downright lying to your face. And that, I suppose, is what we're really talking about here. How can you tell the truth from the lies? And how can you tell not just the blatant, obvious lies, but also the far more difficult to spot and arguably more dangerous uses of misleading and subtle deception, which can sometimes get past our critical filters that we should usually have when we're reading any news. Anyway, I'm massively indebted to Valencia College in Florida for providing this amazing list of fake news examples, some of which are sort of comic, some of which are tragic. So I'll just go through the list really quickly. These are examples of sort of properly fake news. In other words, news that is just verifiably wrong. It's lies, and they were intentional mistruths as well. So the propagators of the news were intentionally trying to lie to people. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't that someone hadn't considered certain sources, but there's decent evidence that in all of these cases, the motive was to just straight up lie to people. So first of all, coronavirus bioweapon, how China stole coronavirus from Canada and weaponized it. Now that's a strong start. That seems sort of fairly obviously ridiculous. There's so many questions that come tumbling out of my mind just from reading that. But anyway, that's perhaps an example from the more obvious end of the fake news spectrum, where you can tell just by reading the headline that it's got to be nonsense. Second, French president tweets rainforest fire photo. Now, that's an interesting example where you sort of think, what? Well, I guess he might have done that, but you want to read on. It's quite a clickbait heading where you sort of think, oh, what's he done now? And you think, oh, let's find out more. But Valencia College has checked it out and it's turned out to be complete nonsense. But it's quite sort of enticing. So that is a slightly more dangerous example of fake news. Anyway, I'll keep going. Donald Trump sent his own plane to transport 200 stranded Marines. False, he didn't. FBI director received millions from Clinton Foundation. His brother's law firm does Clinton's taxes. This has got all the elements that certain people want to consume. And this is another crucial theme about fake news, is that some people want to be lied to. They want to be sold a fantasy. And there is this an obsession in some quarters of American politics with the Clinton family, as if they are some sort of demons that are trying to undermine the United States. And almost anything that reinforces that narrative will be considered real by some people, regardless of how outlandish it is. And there's an even more ludicrous example than the one I just read coming up shortly. Next, Pope Francis shocks the world, endorses Donald Trump for president. Not true, he didn't. 3 reasons why you should stop eating peanut butter cups. Okay, I mean, I guess there are actually probably more reasons why you should stop eating peanut butter cups, but anyway, the reasons given were nonsense. Israeli defense minister, quote, if Pakistan sends troops into Syria on any pretext, we will destroy this country with a nuclear attack. Such a threat was never made. Obama signs executive order banning the Pledge of Allegiance in schools nationwide. Nonsense, he did no such thing. Bill and Hillary Clinton were reported to be using a pizza restaurant as a front for a paedophile sex ring. So I promise you there was an even more silly and outrageous story with regards to the Clintons. This, as you may be aware, is one of the base conspiracy theories of the QAnon movement in the US, that there is a paedophile sex ring operating in Washington, D.C. out of a pizza restaurant. Someone was so convinced by this that he went into this pizza restaurant armed with a gun and intending to kill people. I mean, it's kind of amazing that anyone could be sold on such an outrageous lie. But I suppose it shows that how once lies begin to propagate, you can start to make them more and more outlandish. You could start with something that stretches the truth about the Clinton family. And of course, Bill and Hillary Clinton have been in public consciousness since the 1990s, so a long time. And of course, as a president, you receive a lot of critical press coverage, and some of which will have been somewhat distortive of reality. Some of it would have been certainly rooted in reality, but might be a bit misleading. I mean, there are all sorts of famous examples from when Bill Clinton was US president, for example, that Hillary Clinton had thrown a mobile phone at his head, or that she'd thrown a lamp across the room at him, or that he'd spent hundreds of dollars on a haircut and delayed planes because he had the haircut done in Air Force One. It's just par for the course. Presidents get this sort of treatment all the time. But of course, as you start to ratchet up the silliness, people can start to sort of get themselves, I don't know, desensitized to more and more crazy. And so by the time you suddenly say, oh yeah, by the way, Bill and Hillary are running a paedophile sex ring in Washington, D.C., Okay, most people will have checked out long ago and said, no, come on, seriously, this is just mad. But others would say, yeah, that totally makes sense. That sort of puts so many pieces together. I knew they were evil. I knew they must be pedophiles. And it all just it all becomes a little bit dangerous. And especially, when armed people go in and threaten the restaurant. Thankfully, that person was stopped and arrested. But you can see the potential consequences are outrageous. Again, slightly silly. RuPaul claims Trump touched him inappropriately in the 1990s. That's not true. US bacon reserves hit 50-year low. You can tell that some people would really freak out at that sort of news. And finally, Yoko Ono had an affair with Hillary Clinton in the 70s. So these stories are all nonsense. But you can see how some are more silly than others. Some are, plausible and certainly intriguing and liable to lead to lots of clicks and shares on social media and all the rest of it, which is kind of what people want to happen. They want their story to gain that sort of traction. It's an example of what's sometimes called mimetics, insofar as a meme behaves like genetics. It propagates itself like a gene does, and it's a sort of survival of the fittest notion that once your meme has the greatest survivability, it will get propagated the fastest. Anyway, what about real news? So can we come up with a clear distinction in conceptual terms between real and fake? Well, as I've already mentioned, it's pretty tough. I mean, you need to be careful as to what you think both real and news mean. I mean, let's sort of park the deep philosophical discussion about what is knowledge, what is truth. It's very interesting, but for our purposes today, let's sort of not get too inured in the whole sort of debate about do we know anything and blah, blah, blah. So we're more just dealing with, I suppose, motives at least. Sure, an article on the Syrian civil war may not be entirely true, but did the author intend to mislead? Did the author want to lie? I think that's possibly an easier way of thinking about it than some sort of objective notion of absolute truth, which we don't really have any access to. I mean, you could even drill into the word news. What counts as news? Does it have to be new to be news? Does it have to be published in a certain context or format? Anyway, again, let's not get too bogged down in. The Ad Fontes media group produced this report of media positioning in the media markets of major Western democracies, and so you can see it here. Oh, sorry, not just Western democracies, but anyway, major sort of news outlets that are consumed. And you can see, if I zoom in a bit, that there is a sort of left-right spectrum across the x-axis, and the y-axis is effectively to do with plausibility, and you can see they've got various metrics from original factual reporting. So that's when the sources of the news are reported verbatim. So the news outlet is basically just a conduit for whatever the sources on the ground are saying. And so basically the Associated Press and Reuters are in the middle of the pack, but also the most likely to just report primary evidence. So that, I suppose, is not particularly surprising. But if you want that sort of baseline understanding of what real news is, it comes from that source. So AP and Reuters will sell content to other media providers who will then editorialize it. So AP and Reuters will basically sell just all of the data, the facts, and they won't sort of zhuzh it up particularly for popular consumption. We can see the BBC is relatively highly ranked with regards to factual reporting and its centrism. Very slightly left of centre. Of course, there is a popular narrative in the UK that the BBC, certainly among some people, is very left-wing. According to this analysis, not so much. We've got CNN Web is slightly more reliable than CNN TV, which is intriguing. And as we continue to sort of drift leftwards and downwards, you get more and more partisan, biased news output from left-wing sources. Okay, so here we can see some of the criteria they use: selective, incomplete, unfair, persuasion, propaganda, or other issues. Okay, and you can go over to the right and see some other suspects that you might expect to see on the right side. So Daily Mail, Fox News, OAN, Newsmax, and as you go all the way down, you get InfoWars, which is just straight up conspiracy theories. Now, of course, the question begging is, well, how on earth do they come up with this? Well, what they use is what's called content analysis, which is where you get usually humans or sometimes machines to read content and analyze it, fairly obviously. And what they do is they come up with a code book, and so they will score a piece of news. So let's take a single article as an example. You'll get someone to read the article and say whether they think it is factual presentation, whether they think it has a particular slant politically. They will talk about how it presents graphics and how it connects headlines to text. And I don't know precisely what codebook they use, but this is just the sort of stuff you often do with content analysis. And then once you've classified a text, you then get other people to do exactly the same thing, so that you can then compare the different classifications and see if there's some sort of consensus on whether or not a piece of media is slanted, is factual, is centrist, and so on. And the more coders you get to do this, obviously, the more consensus you're likely to get. So that's broadly speaking how content analysis works. Of course, the issue with content analysis is that sometimes you may not know you're being lied to. So of course, it's possible that a BBC News article, as an example, presents something as a fact when it's not. And it's very difficult to verify that unless you know it's not a fact. So there is still, of course, a possibility that you just make mistakes and you don't realize that you're being lied to. And so that's, of course, a potential problem. Anyway, that's one method of measuring bias. Now, what sort of types of fake news are there? So it's not just a straightforward lie. There are, according to Claire Wardle, at least 7 types. So you can start with things like satire and parody. So here's a pretty hilarious couple of headlines from the Daily Onion, which is a great satirical newspaper from the US. Subway CEO apologizes for trusting fish who falsify documents to pass as tuna. And organized crime syndicate condemned for history of nepotistic hiring practices. I mean, so they are clearly silly, but sometimes articles from outlets like The Onion are shared widely on Facebook and other social media sites as if they're real. And, if people don't realize it's a satirical source, they may be duped by it. I mean, these 2 articles are so obviously silly that you would have to be pretty credulous not to notice that. But, some people are pretty credulous. Secondly, false connections between the headline, images and content. So sometimes you can get a disconnection between what the headline says and what the story will go on to say. So this is an infamous headline from The Sun before the Brexit referendum. Queen backs Brexit. And then the article goes on to massively caveat that and sort of say, well, we obviously have no evidence for this and blah, blah, blah. But, if all you did was glance The Sun in the newsagents that day and you didn't actually read the article and you didn't read the caveats, you would be convinced, not unreasonably, that the Queen was gung-ho Brexiteer. So that's one thing that can be done. Then, of course, there can be misleading content. There can be false context. There can be imposter content, manipulated content, and then the worst of the bunch is straight up fabricated content. So let me go through a few of those. So we've done the satire, we've done the disjunction between headline and article. So here's an example of misleading content. So this is where you've got the use of graphics. Graphics is a classic way to mislead people. Technically, everything on this screen is mathematically accurate, but it's magnificently misleading. So what it's describing is what would happen if a particular tax cut were to expire and what would happen to the top rate of tax. Now, tax is a very provocative political issue in America. Rich Americans don't like to pay tax, in short. So what they've done is they presented that there would be a change from the current rate, which, as you can see, is 35% up to 39.6%. But they've totally played around with the y-axis, as you can see here. So, if they went all the way down to the baseline, rather than starting at 34%, if they went all the way down to 0, the difference between 35 and 39.6 would look tiny. So what they've tried to do is massively zoom in to make it look like there's a huge jump in your taxes that's about to come round the bend, when that's just, I mean, it's true mathematically, but it's so obviously misleading that it's outrageous, really. Anyway, here's an example of decontextualized news. Now, this is a really clever way of misleading someone. This is where you say something that is straight up true, as far as anything can be true. It's verified. It's based on factual sources and all the rest of it. But they don't tell you the context, or they at least mislead you as to the context. So this is a headline from the Daily Mail. Prime Minister, knife crime is now a disease. Now, what this was based on was that knife crime statistics in central London were going up quite dramatically. Now, of course, that is a terrible thing for central London. But of course, the paper's not telling you that that's the context. So you could assume, if wherever you live in the country, oh God, knife crime is a disease here on my doorstep, even though I live in, rural Wales, knife crime is a disease, except it's not. So this is the newspaper equivalent of clickbait. This is trying to encourage people to buy papers because fear sells. And if you get your audience to be scared shitless, they will buy your copy, even though it's magnificently decontextualized. Perhaps the most sort of dangerous form of fake news is that which is completely fabricated. And this is where you get into the realm of cyber attacks and foreign disinformation campaigns, things like state-sanctioned fake news. So there are various sort of stories about the Russian government having fake news factories where bots and human beings generate false stories in order to influence the media market in hostile countries. An example would be the use of deep fakes, which is where you basically animate a figure to speak and say certain things that the real individual never said. There are various ways that through computer analysis we can spot deep fakes, but they are becoming increasingly sophisticated, and it is therefore very difficult. So you can therefore end up seeing on something like Facebook a video that purports to be Barack Obama saying something crazy and outrageous when he said nothing of the sort. Okay. So how can we do something about it? Well, first of all, should we do something about it? Should we seek to tackle fake news? I mean, there are, of course, quite important protections for freedom of speech in liberal democracies. That when we say we should tackle fake news, I guess the assumption is that you need to sort of stop people expressing themselves. But, is there anything sort of inherently wrong with someone saying a load of old cobblers? I mean, there is, of course, certain arguments that it may have tilted the balance in the Brexit referendum, or it may have affected the 2016 US presidential election. So there are sort of fears that the propagation of fake news is having macro political consequences. But maybe, we could end up doing something far worse if we tried to clamp down on people expressing themselves, even if they express themselves falsely. We could end up in a situation where one of the foundation pillars of a democracy, the right to free speech, is completely curtailed in the name of tackling a fairly small minority of psychopaths that try and undermine the way that the country works. So, you could end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There are also, of course, laws against slander and libel. So if someone does say a barefaced lie about a public figure, that public figure can sue them for that. I mean, it's difficult if you are a public figure and you are performing a public duty, that the protections for free speech are particularly robust in those contexts. But if you're a private figure, then it's much easier to protect yourself from people that would try and lie about you. I mean, an example of suing for libel in a public context was Andrew Mitchell, former government chief whip, who was alleged in a newspaper to have called a policeman a pleb. And that was, of course, considered to be both, snobbish, rude, and completely inappropriate from a cabinet minister to a police officer. Mitchell sued for libel, claiming that he said no such thing, but he lost the case and had to pay millions of pounds in damages. So in that instance, his protections for libel didn't work, or maybe they did work, because honestly, I have no clue whether or not he called a police officer a pleb or not. The point is that there are at least some protections already baked into the system. So if we go about sort of saying, right, we're going to squash fake news, we're going to end it forever, could end up causing more harm than good. So maybe we should just embrace the fact that we have a truly free market of ideas, and that sometimes the free market is going to be pretty raw and chaotic, and that could be okay. It could even be valuable. Perhaps it would be better just to educate people to be more critical in their thinking processes, so they're not duped by this sort of content. Although the content is so sophisticated that it's very easy to be duped. Anyway, there are, of course, other difficulties. So, for example, sometimes the fake news doesn't even come from within your own jurisdiction, so you can't really stop it. If it's coming from Russia or China and it's going into the American media market, you can't stop that very easily without stopping the internet. So that can be very tricky. But certainly identifying the origins could help you label some of the news as potentially untrustworthy. So Facebook and Twitter have started to try and put labels and warnings on certain sources to suggest that they are not reliable. Of course, checking the origins of where something's been posted is magnificently difficult, because if you're a committed fake news peddler, you will likely use a VPN, a virtual private network, to hide and mask where you're coming from. You could also assess the motives and try and work out from the content itself what its likely motive is, and try and flag that up and give a warning to readers. So rather than stopping readers from accessing the content, you could just sort of give them a bit of a health warning. And I'll give you a description in a minute of how we can use machine reading techniques in order to very quickly assess the possible motives of an author. So you could sort of say, almost like a film rating, this news story is rated 18. People over the age of 18 should read this. Younger people should be careful, whatever. Anyway, you can automatically sort of classify the content. That could come with all sorts of complications, of course, and ethical problems, but it's doable. You can also, specifically, you can use that content analysis that we've just described from measuring the positions of different newspapers, and you can scale it up using what's called Bayesian theory, which is where you allow computers to learn. So once you've taught a computer, by the way, this is what a centrist, impartial, fact-based piece of news looks like, it can then quickly identify very similar things. And then if you teach it, oh, this is what an insanely biased left-wing thing looks like, and this is what an insanely right-wing biased thing looks like, then again, it can just go and classify on its own. So through machine learning, you could potentially do it automatically. But that wouldn't be easy and would potentially fail a lot of the time. It's also worth thinking about sort of the actual rudiments, the specific methods by which you can bias somebody and introduce misleading content. Okay, one of the first things, of course, is targeting. So you need to know your audience, and you need to know who you're targeting it to. If you want people to be receptive, you need to push their buttons. So the examples of the Bill and Hillary Clinton content were absolutely just jamming the buttons of a particular demographic in the US who, for reasons that I can't fully understand, hate with a burning passion the Clinton family. And so anything to do with Bill or Hillary Clinton is already going to rile them up. And if they see that in a tagline, they're just going, right, must read this. I hate them so much. So, you frame the content in the way you want. Framing is quite an art form. Framing is where, if you imagine a picture frame as the metaphor, framing is where what you put inside the frame is presented as the relevant information, and anything that's left outside the frame, even if it is relevant, is presented at least as irrelevant. So you decide what goes inside the frame. Okay, and so here's an example from the Daily Mail: Europe's war on British justice. Now this is an example of use of human rights law in Europe in order, in theory, according to the paper, to strike down British laws and to block British government ministers from behaving as they might otherwise do so. Now, this is framing insofar as they're giving snippets of truth, but they're omitting loads of other relevant bits of information. For example, when you hear the word Europe, you may jump to the conclusion that we're talking about the European Union, but we're not. We're talking about the European Court of Human Rights, which is not an institution within the European Union. It's an institution within the Council of Europe, which is not an EU body. So the Daily Mail knows its audience. It knows its audience hates the European Union, by and large. And so if it just says Europe, then everyone will leap to the conclusion, oh, that must mean the European Union. It doesn't. It doesn't even remotely mean the European Union. But because of framing, a very clever bit of targeting and framing, the Daily Mail have basically encouraged people to reach the wrong conclusion. Okay. Priming is a similar device, but this is where you prime someone to explode. So if you keep telling people that Bill and Hillary Clinton are mad and bad and sad, then they will make those connections on their own in the future. If they see anything to do with Bill and Hillary Clinton, they are primed to think ill of them. Similar things as you've just seen with regards to Europe and the Daily Mail. Everything about Europe is awful, dreadful, terrible. And so when there's a news story about Europe, you're already sort of angry. You're thinking, oh God, I'm so primed to be cross because it's been repeated over and over to me. Okay, and it's not just some particular news outlets. A lot of news outlets will do this. Even those on the left, right, centre, almost everyone will consistently hammer home the same or similar messages. So perhaps more familiar to those on the left is sort of consistent negative commentary on Donald Trump. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm no fan of Donald Trump, but he has arguably been a victim of quite similar processes to the Clintons, to the European Union, where there's just this repetitive drip, 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 drip of negative media. Perhaps he deserves it, but we are all primed now such that if there's anything new about Donald Trump that comes out, we're already going to be thinking certain ways about it. We're already psychologically primed. So as with anything, you just got to make sure you keep a critical eye, that you've got to say, well, this is a new piece of information. Try and dissociate it from all the other sources of information so that you're not just integrating it into some sort of big narrative about Donald Trump that you think or Europe or the Clintons or whatever. Keeping a critical mind is always going to be the most healthy thing whenever you're reading news or doing anything else the like. Anyway, why don't we try it out? Well, so let's start with a bit of content analysis. So this is what I was describing earlier, where you read a piece of news and you classify certain elements about it. So let's start with this piece of news, which is from Vox. Vox, according to the positional analysis, is center left. And here's an example of some criticism of Donald Trump. And what you can do is you can analyze every aspect of it. You can analyze the language, you can analyze the layout of the page, you can analyze the pictures, you can analyze any graphics, you can analyze everything. You can determine what code book you want to put together. Okay, so I mean, just starting with the headline, Trump just mused about whether disinfectant injections could treat the coronavirus. Really? So it's quite sarcastic, and that gives you an instant sort of lead into the story. It's also, I mean, you should get really into the weeds of it. It also says that he mused. Now, that's kind of metaphorical language. He didn't literally sort of go around, I'm musing, I'm thinking in this sort of slightly lofty way. So they are mocking him by using that term. Imagine if they'd used a different verb there. Trump just said that disinfectant injections could treat the coronavirus. It gives a subtly different, but nonetheless absolutely different perception. So the choice of verbs is very important. So even just within the headline, we can extract quite a lot of interesting information. You can look at the photo, so it's looking at the back of him and standing slightly sort of awkwardly looking at a huge poster saying best practices. I mean, of course, we can all be guilty of overanalyzing these things and drawing conclusions that aren't valid, but that's why you have intercoder reliability. That's why you have multiple people or multiple machines analyzing the same content so that you get some sort of reliability. And then, you can go into the main text with his hyperhydroxychloroquine in the rearview mirror. It's another metaphor, not real. President Donald Trump used Thursday's White House press briefing to muse about whether disinfectants and sunlight might be the new miracle coronavirus cures of the moment, much to the bewilderment of Dr. Deborah Birx. Okay, so anyway, you get the gist. Here is the same story, but this time from CNN. So quite a good idea is to see how different news outlets deal with the same content. Doctors reject Trump's dangerous suggestion to use disinfectant as a coronavirus treatment. Okay, so interestingly here, CNN are trying to base their reporting in expertise. So they're saying, clever people say that this is a load of old nonsense, so be careful, right? The main subject of this first verb is doctors. Doctors reject Trump. Oh, I mean, if that was just the headline, doctors reject Trump, how powerful is that? Within just 3 words, you've got this amazing sort of hammer blow against Donald Trump and his dangerous suggestion to use disinfectant as a coronavirus treatment. Okay, and then we can go on. Washington CNN. Oh, by the way, the picture looks like sort of 3 very concerned people, furrowed brows, and very scared of what Donald Trump's doing. So Washington CNN, doctors are rejecting the idea floated by President Donald Trump. He didn't float anything, so that's another metaphor. Metaphors are really interesting because they are not real, but they are poetic. And so these newspaper writers are using almost poetry and imagery to try and sort of bring to life the story, but it's not true. He didn't float anything. That research should be done into whether chemical disinfectants could be injected into human bodies as a potential coronavirus treatment. Now, another thing to note is that that's a really long sentence. So the reading age for CNN is going to be quite high. There's all sorts of ways you can measure reading age. A classic one is called the Gunning Fog Index, which uses things such as the number of syllables in words and the sentence length to assess reading age. So, for example, the reading age of a newspaper like The Sun is somewhere around an 8 or 9-year-old child. For things like CNN and for broadsheet newspapers like the Financial Times, it's going to go up to about sort of 15, 16 plus. And so, again, that can have quite significant implications as to how the readers feel about what they're reading. Some readers, for example, might be alienated by difficult content that's worded using lots of flowery vocabulary. Others might be put off by the opposite, by being sort of spoken down to, seemingly. So there are all sorts of ways you can analyze the text to try and find interesting patterns. And the key thing is just to have a good old think about it and notice these things. As I was saying in previous sessions, just unlock your inner toddler and ask, well, why have they done that? Why did they use that photo? Why did they use that font? Why did they use that particular verb? Why did they use that source of imagery? Why did they use that metaphor? Why? That's how you do critical analysis. So here's Fox News. So usually very supportive of Donald Trump, and this time no exception. On the same story, media erupt over Trump comments on disinfectant and sunlight to cure coronavirus. Here's what he said. So now the subject of the verb in the first sentence is not doctors, but media. And again, we've got a great little metaphor, erupt. I mean, the media did not erupt, literally. Might have made quite a mess if they did. So it's poetic, it's visualizing something, but it's not true. You can't literally erupt. So there we go. Here's what he said. So again, we've got a picture. This time we've got a picture of Donald Trump facing the camera and looking at someone talking, so suggesting there's a degree of consensus. President Trump, in his White House coronavirus task force briefing Thursday, appeared to suggest that light and disinfectants might have the potential to treat the coronavirus, prompting a number of stories condemning the comments, others seeking to defend the president, and a scathing tweet from presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden. Okay, so another thing that Fox News is doing is trying to pivot the story away from President Trump towards other individuals that its reader base find objectionable for various reasons, in this case, Joe Biden. So anyway, that's an example of content analysis where you go through multiple sources, ideally talking about the very same story, and see what techniques they use to try and basically get in your freaking head. Okay, because that's what newspaper editors are doing. They are trying to scare you, they're trying to upset you, they're trying to annoy you, they're trying to delight you. That's how they sell their copy. And if you start to spot it, it makes you much more powerful because you'll become more immune to their wiles and what they're up to. Anyway, moving on. Another thing that you can do is what's called sentiment analysis. Now, sentiment analysis is quite similar from content analysis. It's derived from a similar method, but it's much more automated. So this is where we can start using proper computer machine reading. What happens is that you set up bags of words, or BOW, and you work out whether or not they are positive or negative. So there could be certain words such as happy, delightful, fascinating, wonderful, which would tend to be described as quite positive in their affect. And then you get sort of sad, unlikable, awful, depressing, and fairly obvious other adjectives and descriptive words that would be negative. And then you try and sort of work out the association between your positive or negative descriptors and the thing being described. So if it's talking, for example, about the European Union, does it describe the European Union as happy, delightful, wonderful? Is there a sort of conjunction between positive words and the European Union, or is the European Union, bureaucratic and slow and sluggish and undemocratic and, more negative imagery? You can analyze this very, very quickly and come up with some statistical approximations of how slanted a piece of media is. And given modern computer technology, you can use sentiment analysis to analyze enormous amounts of data. I mean, you can, for example, analyze every tweet that Donald Trump has ever sent. There are data files containing those tweets. So, if you're so inclined, you can run those analytics. And so it's really fascinating, and it's actually really quite easy to try, and even at least to start out on. So, for example, there's this website, Monkey Learn, where you can try it out. You can just drag and drop some text and give it a go yourself. So that's one way to sort of start off with it. If, for example, we go back to to one of these articles, let's see, how about CNN? Okay, and we take their opening few lines like this, copy and paste, and then classify text, and it'll say that it's neutral. Okay, so that's interesting. So what about if we try Fox? Okay, and we can copy. Like I say, you can, in theory, do this for millions, if not billions of words. Classify text. Negative. Okay, that's interesting. 93.5% confidence that it's negative. Okay, interesting. And bear in mind that the key to the things they're talking about are the media and Joe Biden, so that could be quite intuitive that it's quite negative. Anyway, so that's a good place to start. Monkey Learn is quite interesting, but you can also program these things yourself pretty easily. So one thing you can use is the terminal in your computer. So if you've got a Mac, it's called Terminal. If you've got a Windows PC, it's also these days called Terminal, I think. You need to download Python, which is the coding language that's used for something called NLTK. So if you say import NLTK, you'll have to install NLTK first, but that's pretty straightforward, and there are instructions online how to do that. NLTK, by the way, is the Natural Language Toolkit, and that has a lot of inbuilt software that can allow you to do all sorts of cool stuff with machine reading. What it does is one of its basic functions is a part of speech tagger. So it tags bits of language and it says, oh, that's an adjective, that's an adverb, that's a noun, that's a whatever. And if you think some words can be quite ambiguous, take a word like free. The word free can be a noun, as in the free. It can be an adjective, I am free. It can be a verb, I will free you from your captivity. And what NLTK can do, just like search engines for computers, is it can work out what the word most likely is given its position within a sentence. So you start with importing NLTK. Just got to get the instructions. Okay. Then you need to make sure that you've got all of the right. Actually, I put all these instructions here, haven't I? Hang on, put them all in my slides. So I'm making my life unnecessarily difficult for myself. Here we go. So then you need to go to, let me just pull up the terminal again. So I'm just going to copy all of this. Sorry, you'll see I'm not the fastest typer in the world. Yeah, so NLTK dot download open brackets Veda lexicon. This is just the bags of words. So this is the thing that sort of clusters words into being positive, negative, and all the rest of it. Okay, and then we need to do from nltk.sentiment import sentiment intensity analyzer. Oh no, it's with a Z and there's no space. Okay, there we go. And then SIA, sentiment intensity analyzer,